such a pleasure on this episode of Words, Images, and Worlds to be talking with fellow scholar, delightful person, Amélie Lemieux. Amélie, you are an associate professor at the University of Montreal. Is this correct?
Yes, that's right.
I thought so. I thought so. I wanted to make sure that I had the most recent bio. And you've written widely. You've contributed to journals, Reading Research Quarterly being one of those, one of the flagship journals of literacy. And you also have a book, Deconstructing Literacies, Considerations for Engagement.
Absolutely. And thank you for welcoming me on your amazing podcast, Jason. Much
Well,
appreciated.
thank you. Yeah, thank you for saying yes and being willing to join. You probably don't remember this at all, but you were actually presenting in, I want to say, one of the first sessions at LRA that I ever went to. It was about body mapping. It was pre-pandemic, and I don't remember if it was the 2016 conference or the 2019 conference, but I remember that quite well.
Oh my God. Yeah, that was in Nashville. Actually, I think it was my first LRA, and maybe I was a second year doctoral student back then, or third year doctoral student, quite young. Yeah.
Yeah,
But,
yeah.
yeah, about 10 years ago, something like that. Was it 2015 or 2016? I can't remember.
I
But I
think it
remember,
was 16. I think it was
yeah,
16. I was
like,
also a second year doc student at that
oh
point.
wow. Matt, can you imagine? And now you have all these books out and thriving and living literacy is amazing. I love that.
Yeah, well, we do what we can. We do what we can. I've just sort of followed the path of what I found interesting. I don't know about you, but there seems to be so much that you can get sort of tangled in, and it's nice to pursue the things that are really kind of a joy to write about and read about in the case of editing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I remember this symposium was thought about by Jennifer Brazel, one of my good colleagues and mentors, and we started being interested in mapping in different ways.
Hmm.
Back then, I was working on aesthetogram, so how to map basically reactions to visual texts like films and novels and play-based texts too. Um, so yeah, it's been a journey, and I think my interest in reading and literacies is really intertwined with the arts, digital literacy, anything visual, basically. And I've always had this obsession with mapping since I was a child. So pretty much like atlases, like when I used to go to the library, it was to, pick up atlases and see where the world like how the world operated in terms of boundaries and territories and things like that. So it's been a recurrent theme,
Hmm.
um, and in my work anyway. So place, space, things like that,
Love
as
it.
it
Yeah.
caters to the arts and ways of representing that in the world.
Yeah, I've always been interested in sort of the visual and the arts and representing reality and the way that stories kind of speak to the things inside us that are told visually and through prose. I did my dissertation in film, and it sounds like we have so many common interests.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
definitely. And I think we have a common understanding that comics and film and, even monomodal literature, transmedial worlds operate in sync and
Hmm.
for the benefit of student engagement, right? And I feel like the compilation of different narrative story worlds can just create a bigger metaverse that helps us understand stories differently. I think we're
Yeah,
on the same page on that,
I think
definitely.
so. Yeah, yeah.
Right?
Uh,
And we can find that in the everyday. I was just in Brisbane visiting one of my colleagues, Georgina Barton, who works on literacies in the arts, and I visited one of the museums there, the Modern Museum of Art, and there were so many maps, and
mhm.
indigenous knowledges and how they represent and use materials, found materials to just map their literacies. And I think it's such a beautiful, powerful way to construct and deconstruct the ways in which we navigate the world. And I think there's actually relationships with transmediality because you know, it brings about the question of when does the story start and when does it end,
Hmm.
right? And I feel
Hmm.
like it's what we call in French a mise en abîme, which means like, you know, it's a story within a story within a story and different interpretations that help us understand narratives. And technically, that's what happens in our classrooms. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like every child, every adolescent has a different reading or understanding of a narrative. And compiled together through discussions, you become to a larger understanding of a work, a literary work, an artwork. And I
Hmm.
think that changes from class to class and from year to year, you know, with you know, a general understanding of, you know, characters and actions, but different, I guess, felt sensibilities
Yeah.
uh, in rapport to those characters and stories.
This is now making me think about something along the lines of like a classroom cartography, where sort of every student, including the teacher who's sort of the lead student, I guess, uh, gets to design, envision the space and represent it in a particular way because you have the story that you're reading often in a language literacies classroom. And then there's like the story that's told of the classroom itself. So it's almost like a story within a story.
Definitely, and extensions, you know, like it's so interesting the work on transmediality that we do because it brings about the question of fandom
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
fandom, you know, even in classrooms and outside of classrooms contribute to co-constructing story worlds. And I think I worked a lot on engagement in my thesis, then later in the two books that I wrote. Um, and one of the common themes that I observed is that just the fact that you react to an artwork is actually engagement. So
Hmm.
whether that is positive or negative, that constitute like somebody who cares about the narrative. So fandoms are so funny in that way because they're gonna love this one character and then the other film or the other comic book, they're not gonna appreciate. So it makes or break the narrative pretty
Yeah.
much. But it's still engagement when you
Yeah.
think about it. It's still reception. It's still a reaction to. So certainly, I feel like these metaverses don't they don't leave people indifferent.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, and I'll just mention here, you've been kind enough to contribute to a project I've been pulling together with transmedia, and glad to feature you in that work by means of a preface. Um, I am curious if I could tuck a question here about your participatory fandom. What are the worlds that you most like to engage in?
In terms of transmedial works that I
Hmm.
like.
Hmm.
Hmm. It started so young. I would say X-Men is one of the ones that keep you know, I even wrote about it in my one of my colleagues' books in French. And I salute him, Germain Duarte. He's at the University of Bolzano. And his work was also very instrumental in understanding narrative story worlds in terms of fractal objects,
Hmm. Hmm.
and how they're like they constitute basically snapshots in time. So if I look back at my life, basically when I started being super interested, well, I was probably 5 years old, and with my cousins, we would watch the X-Men comics in the 90s. And
Hmm.
then I would go to their house and we would play with those little figurines. And then, you know, they would read the comics. So it's really my big brothers who, you know, passed on that sort of engagement, and I wanted to play with them. So it constituted a mini familial or family based fandom. And then I started purchasing the comic books. But for me, the medium with X-Men that worked the most after the comics on TV were probably the films
Hmm.
in the
Hmm.
2000s. So like the first X-Men 2000 And then the one in 2002 was X2, and then X-Men 3, The Last Stand was in 2006. I think those series, I watched them over and over and over and over again. And I wrote a chapter on transmedial characters and how we associate characters to specific actors. So, for example, Hugh Jackman is Wolverine, yeah.
Uh-huh.
Then, you know, he's aged. He's aged. It's been like what, 25 years now. So, you know, who is he gonna pass on that role? And then, you know, like if we're thinking about a character like Jean Grey, um, you know, it was Famke Janssen at the time who incarnated Jean Grey, and then that switched to Sophie Turner in the 2010s. So my whole reflection in that chapter on transmedial character is why do female actresses get replaced
Hmm.
and male characters or male actors get pretty much put on a pedestal, yeah, the more they age
Yeah.
and you know they're able to keep up with the shape and whatnot or with a certain standard. And then you know I would have loved to see Famke Janssen in the 2010s incorporate Jean Grey, but they had to switch the timeline too and make Jean Grey look younger so that the fandom wouldn't react so strongly, right? So
Hmm.
it's all these intricacies that I'm interested in. Like we associate characters with people and certain representations and how they move and how they embody, right? A certain representations that we have based on comics, et cetera, et cetera. So this to me is so interesting. And it's a phenomenon that I really care about because it brings about engagement through reaction to, you know.
Yeah, yeah. And the X-Men is such an interesting story. First it's called X-Men, which they commented on in the Dark Phoenix remake of, "Hey, why is it X-Men and men only?" But just interesting as far as thinking about the social landscape and how that story comments on people that are othered, people that are accepted, and people that are somewhere in between, and how individuals respond to that. You know, Charles and Eric, and the way that they engage with that question, just really interesting as far as the commentary you can explore there.
Yeah, absolutely. And aging, you know, the aging of the actors, if they want to take on that role or not,
Mhm.
things like that. What's also interesting to me in those movies, and Marvel does this beautifully, is the what I call the cross-pollination of transmediality. So for example, like you're gonna have Hugh Jackman as Wolverine show up in a Deadpool movie, or
Mhm.
like just the Wolverine movie, you're gonna have Ryan Reynolds as Deadpool show up, right? To sort of pick up the pace and create a narrative with certain characters and actors associated to them. So it's like parallel universes, but they still contribute to the main arc.
Yeah.
So that's also super interesting to me. And I look forward to seeing how it translates. And in terms of social justice too, like we've seen amazing, I find the comic and you also know a lot about this, Jason, but I find that the comic book or comic universe world has evolved a lot in the last 10 years, just in terms of social justice, right?
Mhm.
Making main protagonists like, you know, Spider-Man uh, being racialized, say, representations of main characters, or, you know, having homoerotic sort of narrative arcs in the stories. And I think we're progressing in a way, even though fandoms can be brutal at times. I feel like at least designers and the whole Marvel economy is heading to a positive direction. Even, you know, Marvel heroines having their own movies. I saw this movie on the plane with what's her name? Dakota.
Dakota Fanning.
Yeah, is that right? Like she's she has her own like Spider-Man sort of
Oh,
movie.
Dakota Johnson. Dakota
Yeah,
Johnson.
Dakota Johnson, yeah.
Yeah.
I thought it was cool, you know, like it was well done and why not? And I
Yeah.
think more and more we see that even with Sophie Turner. She had her own X-Men movie with the Dark Phoenix. And I think we're progressively seeing those changes.
Yeah, yeah. Really interesting and heartening to see representations of characters that way. And it also makes me think about what we were talking about with mapping and how characters relate to each other. As you were saying, how characters change, they get recast. One could indeed construct an interesting map of how that happens.
Absolutely, and it makes me think that everything is enmeshed and interrelated. And I talk about that in deconstructing literacies and how I basically map out how literacies, the arts, and digital literacy are imbricated just at an epistemological level, even, and then as an enacted level. It's as a researcher in literacy, and that's always been part of my being. It's more anchored now, but I always see myself as part of the object that I'm studying.
Hmm.
And I know for some people it can be untraditional. It certainly is. But it's an epistemology that I really, really embrace, right? And I
Hmm.
talk about that in my recent article in Reading Research Quarterly about effective positionalities. And it makes me like when I'm very, very close to the object of study or the phenomenon that I'm studying, it allows me to ask questions differently. Questions when I did the research design that I didn't even think about because the research context changes, then the time changes, even if you had breakfast that morning, it changes how you're gonna be in the setting. At least for me, that's what happens. So yeah, I want to bring attention. I want to help people see that and that there's no shame in being so transparent about who we are and why we do that work and just being aligned with our most authentic self and doing literacy's work.
Yeah, yeah, I love that direction, and it makes me think if you're in a room, you are in fact in the room, and I'm with you on that honesty and authenticity of stating positionalities and recognizing that by virtue of examining a question, you are probably part of the question at least. Maybe the answer as well, but at least part of the question.
Exactly. And even the words we choose to ask questions and also when we have interact, that's why I love semi semi-guided interviews or what we call it, semi-organized them because we have the space to ask questions
Hmm.
that otherwise would be so static and human relationships don't work like that.
Yeah.
So it's just for me it's I try to do work where literacies can breathe and just be relational and all in movement and reciprocity, and I think most people try to do that, but I try to give myself I guess the tools that align with my most authentic self and my most transparent self and being comfortable with that. Definitely.
Yeah, yeah. I also appreciate the use of photography in deconstructing literacies, the way you link what your descriptions are with the images that you included there. I had the chance when it came out to review it, and so that's one of the things that being a very visual person really stood out to me.
Yeah, and thank you again for your very generous review of my book. I remember when I read it, I was so moved by it.
Oh,
So yeah, so for me, photography, I mean, I learned photography. I took photography courses when I was like, I don't know, 12, 13. When I was a child, I always had a camera, like a 35 millimeter camera in my hands. Um, it's always been part of my being. And to me, it's a logic of documenting. I document everything that I do, where I am, the hour, the sense, the smell, because it helps me remember.
Hmm.
And when
Hmm.
I remember, I become so close to the recollection of events as they happen and how I'm able to reconstruct that and also see some blind spots and really just be true to myself and my subject and how I felt at that time and where I was at that time. So sometimes we have dips, right? And you want to remember how you felt because it also allows you to jump out of it. So I think it's important. And in the interviews we conduct, we want to remember how we were at that exact time. There are other factors maybe in our lives that maybe affected how we were as an interviewer, and that happens with our participants too as
Hmm.
interviewees. So it's a specific moment in time that's imbricated in quantum physics, basically. And I feel like photography helps us um just going back to that atmosphere, even though like did you shoot in the morning, at night? What was the atmosphere? What were you shooting? Things like that. So and it's definitely linked to an effective positionalities framework. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you also for linking quantum physics and literacy. I don't think I've heard that linking before, so appreciating that. As you're thinking about literacy, is there a particular metaphor that comes to mind or set of metaphors?
Yeah, well, I thought about that a bit earlier today, and I think it goes back to an enmeshment
Hmm.
or like
Hmm.
a cord with multiple strings, right? Made of different materials that's just very solid. But as you construct it, you add a cord to it. I also think about literacy as constellation. I've thought about that for the last probably 8, 10 years, and it really comes back to um, I don't want to say literacy events because I think we're past that sort of frame of thinking, but
Hmm.
I see literacies as being relational in space.
Yeah.
So a lot of my work is rooted in posthumanism, and posthumanism is framed to or linked to quantum physics. So it's about exchanges of energy, what it produces, how you're affected, how you affect people. And I think it's situating ourselves in this in specific moments of time and space.
Hmm.
And it's very situational. Like this, and it's yes, it's contextual. Yes, it's our linguistic baggage, our cultural ethnic baggage. It's everything together, but it's also very, I would like to think that there's a bit of fate, FATE, in the work of literacies. Why were you there at a certain time when this happened? Like
Hmm.
I believe in that pretty much, and I'm very transparent about that in everything that I do. And I think the larger framework here, when we think about literacies, and that's one of my main arguments in deconstructing literacies, is that to understand literacies as a whole, pretty much fully, you understand the traditional practices, but you also know how to deconstruct them.
Hmm.
And same thing with quantum physics, posthumanism, you understand it so much that you're able to see the blind spots and deconstruct it. So that when you have discussions with, you're at LRA or AERA, you can go to any literacy session and understand how it makes sense, right?
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
not see one epistemology as being better than the other, but just um, understand where people come from, understand traditional lineages, and just see research as contributing to this, you know, highway of information that we're all contributing to. And I think everybody has a place in that, and everybody should have room to do their work in a democracy based matter that helps our kids learn and grow.
Yeah, yeah. I love that idea of a constellation, and there's something else you said there that I was going to comment on, but oh, the literacy event, literacy practice. I appreciate Brian Street's work so much, and I so often cite it as something that's foundational. Uh,
Yeah.
but I so often write about practices, and I mention events, but I never really go to events. So I'm just thinking about what you were saying about sort of being past that dichotomy because I almost sort of give a nod to, well, there's also a literacy event, but literacies are so often not one moment or punctiliar. I'm really interested in these ongoing practices that we engage in or that we're required or that we choose to engage in. So just appreciating that comment as well.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the reading of people like Karen Barad, Rosie Braidotti, helped me think about space and time differently.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
it's like a blessing and a curse because once you read those works, it's really hard to see the world differently.
Hmm.
And seeing it as an exchange of energies, an exchange of um, forces at play, entanglements, and things like that. Because when you, like, say, if we didn't have language, right, we would still be able to communicate with each other with in other ways, so gestural, looking, things like that. It still exchanges of energy. So I'm a fan in that way. So I adopt it very much because in a world of instantaneity, where 90% of North American kids have social media,
Hmm.
I think, and they use it daily. Um, I think our literacy practices have changed, right?
Yeah,
And we don't
yeah.
read this, we don't have the same attention that we used to have. And I don't see that necessarily in a bad way. It's just like our ways of comprehending the world is changing.
Hmm.
And our ways of engaging with others is changing for better and for worse. So adapting to those new energies, a quick, fast-paced energy, um, I think our ways of understanding the world need to be slowed down. And I think, traditional reading and also engaging in meta universes can help us understand the world as reflected in the practices that we use on the daily.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
because like we're like this, maybe we have our cell phone here, maybe the TV is playing in the background. Like I think we're multiverse oriented beings.
I love
And
that. Love
we
that.
we embody that on the daily. And that's why I think transmediality makes so much sense to me because you have parcels of information in all these worlds and same thing for the arts literacy, digital literacy have parcels of
Hmm.
truth and taken together, it makes sense. At least to me. I don't know for other people, but it makes sense to me.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. And I think we have one more question on our official list that I always like to make sure that I can include. And then, of course, we can go anywhere else in the conversation that you'd like. I always like to give guests the chance to share resources. So if I'm a teacher out there that's listening, or a researcher, or a doctoral student, since we both met when we were doctoral students, any particular resources, ideas that you would want to share where people can go and learn more?
Yeah, thank you so much for this. I think for the framework that I mostly described now, there's two good resources that could be useful. So the first one would be my book, Deconstructing Literacy's Consideration for Engagement. And in terms of effective positionalities and how to use that in the work that you conduct, the articles and research projects that you want to use. It's in Reading Research Quarterly. It's online first right now, but it will be published as a 2024 publication in the next coming months. Other than that, we have a special issue coming out in Language and Literacy about teaching literacy in disrupting times. And I share with my team the outcomes from our Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada research project on Instagram poetry. So it's another strand of my work where that framework is also imbricated in the results. but we really look forward to this special issue. I coordinated it with amazing people like Lori McKee, Tip Gallagher, Adrian Downey, Joe Stauffer, and Jeffrey Wood. So we're a team of Canadian, pan-Canadian researchers, basically, who got together and we wanted to explore basically the topic of teaching literacy in disrupting times and what that meant, mid 2020s.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and so, yeah, I look forward to that. And if people want to reach out, there's also my website. It's amelielemieux.com, and I'm easily reachable that way.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for the time, the conversation, the collaboration. I'm always interested in the work you're doing and always interested to talk with you and to hear your thinking about the world and literacies. And I also have a love of the visual and the poetic. So great to connect.
Thank you so much for your generosity, Jason, and it's always a pleasure to connect with you and talk about our shared interests.
Likewise.